Welcome to episode 7 of Conflicts of Interest. I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I'm joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Good, man. How you doing, Kyle?
Pretty good. It's been a busy day, but a good one. And nice weekend, a little bit of time to relax. I spent Saturday away from reading the news all day, which was nice, but I got back into it today and read just a ton of stuff. And I don't know. I feel like I guess at least for today's show, we don't have maybe as sensational as headlines as what we have had for the first 6 shows. But I think everything we're going to talk about today is actually really important, and in a world where things are covered based on their actual importance and not what the narrative should be, we would actually be talking a lot more about in the mainstream what's happening, what we're going to be talking about on today's show. So. Will, you got anything else, or should we get rolling here?
Now let's jump into the news.
All right, subscribe to the YouTube channel and share the show for us. That's we could do to help get the show out there to more people and help us to grow. And here we go. First story we have today is I believe we got this from Middle East Eye. Saudi official must testify in 9/11 lawsuits, says U.S. judge. And Will, this is, I guess a part of the 9/11 narrative we really didn't touch on the last show, but is really important, which is, who or what governments are possibly to blame for 9/11. And it seems like at the very top of that list should be Saudi Arabia, the country that Osama bin Laden was from, the country that had 15 of the 19 hijackers on board. And, Prince Bandar definitely had some dubious ties with, the President George W. Bush. So tell us a little bit about what this particular lawsuit is saying and why it could be a step in the right direction for the Americans who did lose loved ones or were injured on 9/11 to see some justice.
Yeah. So as you're saying, we did kind of, unfortunately, we didn't have, there's only so much we can cover with the 9/11 episode. We did kind of leave out the possible Saudi role. We did mention how, many of the hijackers were Saudi citizens, but we're talking now about Saudi officials and like the Saudi state, possible involvement. But just a day before the 19th anniversary of the attacks, which, we covered, a federal judge in the U.S. has now directed the Saudi Arabian government to make a couple dozen current and former officials available for testimony about their possible knowledge or role in the attacks, knowledge of or role in the attacks. And this lawsuit, as I think you hit on, was brought by the families of some of the victims of 9/11 and some of the attacks. And for quite a while now, they have been trying to get it proven and get it out in court that, just exactly what role, if any, the Saudi government had and Saudi officials had. I think probably the most interesting part of this order this judge issued was that one of the officials that may have to testify here is Prince Bandar bin Sultan. You mentioned him. He had a very close relationship with the Bush family to the extent where his nickname was Bandar Bush. But he was also a former ambassador to the U.S. and at one point he led the Saudi main intelligence agency, the GID. So this is like a very high level, key figure in the royal family we're talking about here. There are various factions in the royal family, and he was like one of the in like a high level on one of them. However, in the declassified 28 pages from the congressional inquiry into 9/11, this is where I think we should look to. This is some of the clearest indication we have of possible Saudi involvement, including with Prince Bandar. And in those 28 pages, which remain classified for years and years, and there was this huge push to get them published and get them revealed. Which they eventually were, I think, way back in 2016. So they've been out for 4 years now, and we're just now finally seeing some legal action being done here, where these officials may have to testify. However, in those 28 pages, we have pretty clear indication that there was money flowing from one of Bandar's bank accounts in the U.S. at Riggs Bank, money flowing between his account and some of the handlers of the 9/11 hijackers. So people who traveled to the U.S. to help the hijackers, get IDs and find places to live and stuff like that. There was money transferring between Bandar. I think his wife actually is the person who ended up doing the actual transfer. But nonetheless, I think the best place to go to understand this and to see what the 28 pages show is an article at antiwar.com, the 28 pages explained by Scott Horton's wife, Larissa Alexandrovna Horton, who herself is a great investigative journalist. I won't go into all the details of her breakdown here. It's like very long, and probably better to read that than to hear about it here. But however, I would really encourage people to go check that out to see just like all the connections. There really are clear indications that the Saudis were involved in, at least aware of the 9/11 plot.
Yeah, well, so I think you're making it really important there with Larissa's article that she has like all these, names and dates down because you are making, a really big claim, saying that possibly the Saudi government, who has, been an ally of the United States, we sold them a lot of weapons ever since, 9/11, and in fact, a lot of the actions that we've taken in the Middle East against other countries, specifically look at Bashar al-Assad or the Houthis, it has been on behalf of Saudi Arabia to further their policy. And so, have been making a real mistake all these years if it turns out that the Saudi government or high officials in the Saudi government had anything to do with 9/11. But certainly, it seems like, with Larissa's article, and then, this, hopefully we'll get some more answers here, but she makes a very powerful case. And like I said, has names, dates, and details that we're not going to get on today's show. One thing I guess that I want to bring up is, a part of this whole lawsuit, we've had the U.S. government at times pushing different legislation that would prevent the 9/11 families from getting victims should Saudi Arabia be in any way responsible for 9/11. There's this famous JASPA law that I'm not sure if it ended up getting passed into law, but the Saudi kingdom was actually behind the lobbying effort for that. The story was broken by the guy who runs 28 pages. I think it's .com, but it might be .org. But
Is
he
that
does
Brian
it.
McGlinchey?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
He does a really good job of following what's going on with the 28 pages, but just, Saudi involvement in 9/11 and the aftermath here. But this law that, what it was would prevent people from, suing governments from, I guess, the acts of their citizens, and they said essentially would open U.S. soldiers up to being sued if they commit war crimes overseas. And so, it's a funny admission that they're like, yeah, U.S. soldiers are running around committing war crimes all over the place. There's no way we could possibly pass any legislation that would allow the victims to see justice. Like, that's a pretty crazy omission. But that lobbying effort was something that was being made on behalf of Saudi Arabia to prevent this law from being passed that will hold people accountable for 9/11. And they were utilizing American soldiers for that lobbying effort. I mean, it's just so cynical to do something like that, Will. And that's why I think this case is so important because, as we talked about in the last show, so much of the U.S. foreign policy and everything that happens in the United States has been a result of, 9/11 and our interpretation of that day and, what we think happened. And so, every day when people travel or, the just surveillance on people that happens all the time, the millions, literally tens of millions of people, as we discussed on the last show, that have been displaced and made homeless by America's wars in the Middle East. Well, what actually happened on that day may not be what we have been told. And so, it's very important that we get to the bottom of this at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And one unfortunate thing I think here is like a lot of this with the Saudi officials, like in their testimony, a lot of this is going to depend on whether the Saudis are going to make them available to testify. I don't actually imagine they would like compel many of them to do so. And so like it's going to be up to whether they're willing, it's their willingness to cooperate could put a big roadblock in front of this if they're unwilling,
Yeah.
So.
No, and it's hard to imagine either. You would think it would have to be a lot of political pressure from the United States. If the president calls and says, you better send Prince Bandar over here to testify, or you're not going to get the latest weapons shipment or something, we won't cover for you over at the UN with, your genocide in Yemen. The U.S. has a lot of leverage over Saudi Arabia should we want to use it. And we'll get into a story yet next that really shows, how significant that is. But yeah, it's very important here, what's happening. And, I guess I don't imagine either Trump or Biden doing that, but it does seem like Trump would be far more likely than Biden to do something rogue. Although I doubt he will follow through with it. But I could see him saying it. Oh, we're looking at having some Saudi princes come testify about 9/11. Like I can see that being something that Trump says, but I don't think he has the wherewithal to actually make that happen, because I do think it would be a diplomatic effort that required nuance and concentration and long term, pushing.
Right, right. And Trump would not have to be, he would have to not be fully in the, in the court of some of these Saudi royals like Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince. And unfortunately, it does seem like that is the case, that Trump is very much beholden to him. And we have this next story here, I think, with Bob Woodward's new book, Rage, I think it's called. He's apparently quoting Trump saying that he had protected Mohammed bin Salman and saved his ass after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. By all indications, I don't think anyone found his remains yet, but that's what that's the story we think is most plausible. And so, yeah, I found that to be that's a hilarious development. I don't think it's so implausible. I mean, we've seen if we remember, just in 2018, just after Jamal Khashoggi's murder was becoming a big scandal, Trump blasted through this $8 billion arms deal with the Saudis, way over the objections of Congress, who are all saying hey, we should not be selling weapons to this country when there's all these allegations. And, so I think this is not all that implausible that Trump said these things. It is coming just from Woodward, but, we've seen before that Trump is very much in the court of the Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman.
Right. Well, to me, this seemed like one of those things that Trump said that is true of any administration. They protect dictators when it's beneficial and helpful. Whether it's Al-Sisi or Mohammed bin Salman or whoever the U.S. wants, trying to put Mansour Hadi back in control of Yemen, something like that. We're very willing to do this kind of stuff, but it's often the thing that's supposed to go unsaid. We're not supposed to hear the president say, "Oh, I protected this ruthless dictator after he did something ruthless and terrible." Also of note, lately in the Khashoggi trial, it seems like everybody who is getting punished is getting off very light. And this is in a country where, I mean, up until very recently, women were not allowed to drive, and people are beheaded. Like teenagers are sentenced to being beheaded for social media posts that go against the government. And so, if the story that is put forward by Mohammed bin Salman is true, that he had no idea that this happened, and that it was just some rogue people, you think they'd be actually interested in holding them accountable, but they're in no way interested in doing that. And so it seems like he probably did have something to do with it. And yeah, I can absolutely, this in no way surprises me that Trump said this. I can't believe he admitted to Bob Woodward that he downplayed the coronavirus. That seemed to me, even by Trump's standard, to be pretty a big of saying what's not supposed to be said. But this is within the realm of things that Trump says, and I'm not surprised at all. And I'm sure he did say it, but it doesn't matter if he said it or not. It's the absolute truth that's what the U.S. does. And the other important thing is the truth of what the U.S. would have done, whether the president was Trump, Bush, Biden, Obama, Clinton. This is what the U.S. does. We keep our friendly dictators in power, no matter how gruesome their crimes.
Right, right. And yeah, I think it's also plausible as well, because Trump also maintained the whole time. It's not like he's saying, "Oh yeah, he ordered the killing," and I'm defending him. He's maintaining that, "Oh no, he says he didn't do it." So that's part of Trump's whole story, is that we protected him, and hey, he's being unfairly, targeted or something for his role in this, even though he's the crown prince. But whatever.
Right, the poor Mohammed bin Salman. Anything else really on Saudi Arabia here, Will?
I mean, it is interesting that just as this was happening, this line from Trump and from this Woodward book, we do have a Saudi court sentencing 8 people, I think, between 7 and 20 years for having some role in the Khashoggi murder. I think all their names have been kept secret, so we don't actually know who these people. Maybe somebody knows this, but I haven't actually seen a list of names of the people who are charged. But they are apparently holding some people accountable to some degree with this. But 7 to 20 years, so some of these people might get off fairly easily, We had, I think, 5 people previously who were sentenced to death for like a direct role in the murder, but they've since been pardoned by Khashoggi's family. I think we actually covered that on Foreign Policy Focus, your old show. Um, but I just thought that was interesting. Just as this line was coming out about Trump, protecting bin Salman, we have these other, defendants and suspects in Khashoggi's murder, possibly getting a sort of slap on the wrist if they're only given 7 years. 7 years for a murder plot is, maybe not such a harsh punishment.
Right. Again, in a country where any opposition to the government is punishable by death. And so,
Right, like witchcraft and stuff.
right. Again, if Mohammed bin Salman had nothing to do with it, you'd think he'd be pissed at hell as the people that did, because it cost him a lot of headache. I mean, he had to go on a big apology tour, and I'm sure spent millions of dollars. And it takes a lot to get on Oprah and to, like, correct your public image, and make sure that Twitter doesn't make Saudis sell off their stake, and stuff like that. And so even like Lindsey Graham was like, oh, I can't believe he did this, and was upset about it. So there was a lot of, I'm sure pocket lining and back rubs that Mohammed bin Salman had to give. And I'm sure he would have been really, really, really mad if this was just some rogue people doing something that he didn't want them to do. But that certainly isn't, mirrored in any of the Saudi justice that's been handed down here. And again, as you point out, like there's never been like an official, like, here's where the body is, if any body exists anymore, or I don't know, some like kind of a official thing that you could even present to the family, and I guess to his new fiance or whatever, to kind of, give those people some ease and some peace and stuff like that. But I guess it's still all rather ambiguous as to where his, final resting place is and what happened to him at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So Assange here, Will, talking about his extradition hearing, and I will let you go. And I know you have some notes here about what's happening, and I guess a little bit of your notes are going to be what's not happening, because COVID interrupted the trial yet again.
Yeah, that's right. So on Thursday, the hearings actually for Assange's extradition were paused. Wednesday was the last day we actually had any kind of deliberations or process, because one of the lawyers on one of the teams, I think it was the prosecution side, one of the lawyers representing the U.S., there was a COVID scare where he possibly came in contact with someone, or I think he did come in contact with somebody who had COVID, and so they stopped the whole thing while he had a test to see if he was infected. And ultimately that came back negative, so that they will resume the hearings on Monday. However, we have not had anything happen since last Wednesday because of that. We had a pause in the proceedings.
I was trying to figure this out, and I couldn't find anything, so I'm guessing nobody knows. But I'm just curious if you read anywhere what the plan would have been had the test came back positive. Just interested if they would then stop all proceedings for 2 weeks, or how that will work. Just because if Assange's defense team needs a reason to adjourn, I mean, I'm sure, you get enough people tested, one of them is going to come back positive eventually. And so if you're, thorough enough about, if you want to delay the trial, it seems like it could be a tactic that you could use.
Right. I did not see anything explicit about like what they intended to do should it had a positive diagnosis come back. But yeah, I assume they would have done like more contact tracing and paused the whole thing for a longer period. But here we just ended up with like a small little, delay because of that.
Right. Okay. All right. So last week there was some pretty interesting testimony, and I think we did a fairly good job on the show talking about this stuff, especially from the first and the second day. I will say Scott Horton did an interview with I think his name is Cliven Smith. I'm missing part. He has like 3 names. I'm only got 2 of them.
Clive Stafford Smith, I think.
Yep, that guy. He's really good, and he testified at the Assange hearing. And so I will link to that episode of the Scott Horton Show, along with that article we talked about from 9/11 on antiwar.com in the show notes page, which you can find at the Libertarian Institute. But Will, do you have anything else on Assange's trial? How anything's going, or any interesting hearings or testimony or updates that you've heard in the past week?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to start with that guy, that Clive Stafford Smith, his testimony. There was one interesting moment on the second day of the hearings where Stafford Smith got into this pretty heated argument with the prosecution. It was like a complicated legal matter. They were arguing about like how the case would be prosecuted in the U.S. I think there was a bunch of technicalities they were getting into, but it got very heated. And at one point, Assange actually interrupted and yelled, "This is nonsense," which is kind of a rare, like he doesn't talk very much throughout these trials, and for him to like have this outburst, like that was kind of an interesting rare thing. And the judge actually like chastised him and said like, we'll kick you out of this courtroom if you if you have another outburst like that. And fortunately he did not get kicked out, but I thought that was just like an interesting, like that's one of the most contentious moments of the hearings I've seen so far, or read about so far I should say. I don't know if
Yeah.
did you hear about that?
Yeah, I did. I guess the only part about that disappointed me is that was so much of the mainstream media's focus. At least from looking at like Reuters and AP, that was their headline pretty much for the whole week of
Right.
Assange's hearing. And this just has such a massive weight on journalism and especially national security journalism that you would think they'd be taking this a little bit more serious, but as we talked about last week, a big issue I have is it's really only the alternative media that's doing any like real diligent covering of this. If it wasn't for Consortium News and Kevin Gunstola and Craig Murray, we really wouldn't have a great idea of what the environment was in the courtroom and what was happening there.
Yeah, that's true. Like, yeah, it should, if you only got that little bit of information of his little outburst, like, yeah, that might kind of mislead you of what was said. I mean, Stafford Smith also got into some other interesting stuff about how Assange is actually exposing criminal acts by the U.S. government, and how he's saying that this has a clear, like, obvious public interest element to it, and that is part of what his leaking is. It's not as if he's doing this as like some kind of criminal hacker, who's making money off of it or something. He's saying no, this is all within the public interest because he's exposing evidence of criminal wrongdoing by the American government. And so I thought that was also an interesting part of his testimony.
Right. Well, I thought that was interesting. I wish, and maybe I missed there just wasn't like somebody didn't quote this, but I thought he should have said like, look at Assange's body of work, like clearly like the leaking, like these are principles held close to him. I feel like that's one of the nice things about us doing this show is if ever we're ever in that position, we'd be like, look, this has nothing to do with money. We are making nothing, and we were out here saying like, hey, that this information is important to get out there, and it's not about that. I think that's pretty clear in Assange's case too. And so it's such a shame that there's just so little attention paid to it by the people who really do have the most to lose. I mean, as much as it would more likely be used against somebody in the alternative or independent media versus like the mainstream media, the people who report the most national security leaks are the New York Times and the Washington Post. Now they're official leads versus Assange's leads of information that's embarrassing to them and that exposes their war crimes, but still it's a lot of the times the leads are published on the pages of, and a lot of these leads were published on the pages of the Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post. People want Pulitzers at these institutions for that, and yet now when that seems to all be on the line, they just shrug their shoulders and maybe chalk it up to what they call his personality issues, which are fake anyways.
Right, right. Yeah, all the fake controversy surrounding him and his alleged behaviors at the embassy and all the stuff just to make him radioactive. Um, there was other interesting testimony on some of the other days. I think on day 3 we had this British professor Paul Rogers, who kind of got into like the political argument of just how like the charges against Assange are irrevocably wrapped up in politics, and how the American case against him is it's politically motivated. And that's been like a big part of the defense's argument. And I think that guy articulated it pretty well, this professor. We also had Trevor Tim, who made some of the points that you're just making about how what Assange is doing is not distinct from like what other news organizations do. And in fact, yeah, there was even a point during Tim's testimony when one of the prosecution people, James Lewis, actually questioned whether Assange was a journalist at all. And that's clearly nonsense. I mean, he's worked with some of the biggest, most prestigious, quote unquote, news organizations in the world, the New York Times and stuff. And yeah, it's done like award-winning work with them. So to suggest that he's like, I don't know, he is as much part of the media as they are. and if not more. Like he lives up to the ideals of journalistic transparency and all this stuff better than they do even. But I think what the prosecution was arguing was that because he in certain cases left certain names unredacted, that disqualified him from being a journalist at all. And I think Trevor Tim, his argument was that, like, even if you want to question that editorial decision, that does not make someone not a journalist. If you dispute an editorial decision they made, that doesn't disqualify them from, having protections that a reporter would have.
Right. Yeah, a couple things, I guess, that I have picked up on in the past week that I thought were interesting details. One was that this, not being familiar with the British court system, that this is going to be appealed and likely multiple times by whoever wins or loses, or whoever wants to get something, a different result here. So even if Assange ends up, his extradition is denied or granted or whatever after this, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the final result and say so in what's going on. And then the other thing is from my understanding, it is just this, there's not a jury, that this is like a judge making the decision. And so far she's been pretty hostile against Assange. And so
Yeah.
I don't know why there's a reason to be very optimistic. And then the other thing is they're allowing very few people actually into the courtroom to observe, but they're only giving out, like, I guess, live stream passwords and stuff like that. But from my understanding, a lot of people are having trouble logging in, and the feeds don't stay live. The judge
revoked a lot of them too.
Yeah.
I think.
I believe on the first or the second day, the judge like threw out all the like permissions that they had granted for people to be able to log in, and then they had to reapply, I guess, in a lot of cases. And so I guess it was granted again in a lot of cases, but still it's just extra government paperwork and hurdles. Well, anything else on Assange?
The last thing I want to say is just like we can look forward to in the coming days. I think maybe on Monday or Tuesday, we're going to hear Daniel Ellsberg testify, the great anti-arms activist, anti-nuclear weapons, and all anti-war activist, as well as Patrick Coburn, the great British reporter. So definitely watch for that testimony, I'd say.
All right. Next, let's move on to talk about some things happening right around and in Taiwan. Taiwan carried out a couple of missile tests, and these sparked a pretty big reaction from China, where China decided to then fly some fighter jets, Su-30s and J-10s, into Taiwanese airspace. Nothing, happened. There wasn't any interception, so it looks like, in that sense, it wasn't an event that could have escalated. But it was, a pretty big deal. And as far as, when we talk about these things, going in cycles, it seems to be an escalation on both sides. First, the Taiwanese missile test, and then the Chinese response. Then these two sides played the same thing out on the next day. And, well, I guess for me, the reason that this story is so important is because of the growing U.S. ties with Taiwan, especially throughout the Trump administration, having the highest level official visit to Taiwan, I think, since the U.S. actually recognized mainland China being, the government of China. So was that it's either 71 or 79, I think. And so, that's happened. The U.S. has really increased weapon sales to Taiwan. And so I think Taiwan is then acting more provocative. China, and acting more provocative in response. And then there's, also, I think one of the things that China has been trying to do with their Belt and Road Initiative, where, they'll do essentially what the U.S. will do with the IMF. They'll say, hey, you adopt this kind of policy that we like, then you get this massive loan. And so China is, I think, leveraging some of those loans to do things like getting countries to label their, whenever you get a flight from like wherever, I'm trying to think, St. Petersburg to Taiwan, China wants to make it so that the flag, next to Taiwan is the Chinese flag and not the Taiwanese flag. And, to in that way, I guess, adopt the world culture that Taiwan is a part of China. And so there's a lot of that going on. But, this seems to be very provocative. And in some ways, resembles a little bit of the heightening tensions that we've talked about, like in the Black Sea between the U.S. and Russia, that's been going on the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, yeah, we do see some parallels between those things, and it seems like there's been like a real flurry of activity in like this in and around China, in the waters around China, this year especially. I mean, they're always doing these kind of like the U.S. is often doing these freedom of navigation missions and show of force missions and all kinds of deployments and stuff. We have like a base in Guam and all this stuff. But this year especially, it seems like there's just been a lot more. Like you mentioned, of course, these for 2 days in a row here we had Chinese war. And China, of course, they consider Taiwan like their own, like a province of China proper. And so, they consider that their own territory technically. Whereas the Taiwanese, of course, believe, they're their own republic and they claim sovereignty and all this stuff. And the U.S. does generally align with them. However, yeah, we had these Taiwanese missile drills, these live fire missile drills. But I think those even sort of were in response to these Chinese naval drills, because the Chinese have been doing also their own like big series of naval drills. In the last couple of weeks. I think they were doing them in 4 major regions all at once, actually, simultaneously. So it was a big series of drills. We actually covered this on the show in the context of the U.S. U-2 spy plane flying over one of those naval drills over a no-fly zone. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a very busy last couple months in terms of all these deployments and drills and espionage flights and show of force missions in and around China.
Yeah, and when I just look at the deteriorating economic relationship between the U.S. and China, it seems even more important not to have these kind of tensions, and that it should be, the clear message of the Trump administration to Taiwan that do not pick a fight with China because we do not have your back. I don't think Trump necessarily needs to come out and make that statement publicly, but he needs to be, getting on the phone with Taiwan in response to this and saying like, look, we're not good getting into a shooting war with China for you. So be sure everybody to keep up with what Jason Ditz and Dave DeCampo writing on the news section at antiwar.com, because when the U.S., China, Taiwan, anybody carries out one of these drills, in and around China that raises tension, they're always sure to cover it. I was just reading today, actually, from them that Japan now, Abe's last act as prime minister, he wants to give Japan more missile capabilities and stuff like that. And so that's also tensions and raising the states with China there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we also have the thing like the Quad NATO, that's all with eyes on China, trying to develop these like regional alliances. And, they were talking about wanting to expand that. I forget if they may have mentioned Taiwan. They definitely said South Korea that they wanted to eventually expand that into. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely important to watch, the way the U.S. is emboldening some of these regional countries to, oppose the Chinese.
All right. Well, last big story I have for us today to talk about here is Bahrain normalizes Israeli relations. Signing ceremony is going to be Tuesday, and I think it's going to be like rolled out and rolled into the whole UAE deal with Trump that we haven't covered yet, really, on conflicts of interest. I think, talked about maybe a little bit on the final episodes of Foreign Policy Focus. But I thought it'd be an opportunity to talk about, these 2 deals, which Donald Trump claims, hey, I'm Mr. Art of the Deal man. I got them done. I got the Jews making peace with the Muslims. Am I not just the greatest peace president ever? That's from what I see from the Trump campaign and from the Trump supporters. That's kind of the message that they're trying to spin. So, Will, I was just wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I do absolutely think that that's how Trump's going to totally campaign on these deals. That, hey, I'm Mr. Dealmaker. It's unfortunate he couldn't make any deals where they really count with, the Russians or the Chinese or Iran or North Korea, where there's all these outstanding hostilities, where that would really make a difference in terms of the politics. However, yeah, he's definitely going to be selling these smaller deals with the UAE and Bahrain and the Israelis. And in both cases here, we have because a lot of Arab states don't recognize Israel at all. They don't formally recognize them, obviously, because of the whole Palestine issue. And so it is significant. Before just recently, before the UAE deal, we only had the Egyptians and the Jordanians recognizing the Israelis and having any kind of like real diplomatic ties with them. But now, just recently, we have these other two deals with the UAE and with Bahrain that Trump has apparently helped to broker. I guess Jared Kushner, apparently his son-in-law, had a big part in brokering both of these. I know he's definitely wanted to take credit for arranging some big Middle East peace deal. But barring that, I guess these are like these more piecemeal ones. He's behind them. However, with the UAE deal, there was actually some controversy over whether it was going to entail that the U.S. would be allowed to sell the UAE, more military gear, namely the F-35 fighter jet. I don't think, though, that with the Bahrain one, that's quite as much of a controversy. Because I think the U.S. has actually toyed with the idea a little bit of selling them to Bahrain before. I know that like their king, we gave them like a demonstration flight and we briefed him on them. So I think there has been some interest in possibly making a deal with the Bahrainis over this. So I don't think that'll be quite as controversial as it was with the UAE. However, a very interesting part of this, I think, is that the Saudis are fairly close with the Bahrainis. And so just how this kind of deal may pave the way toward another deal, like that would be the big, one of the big prize, I guess, would be to, beyond negotiating a deal with the Palestinians and the Israelis, I guess with the Saudis, one of the more powerful Arab Sunni states in the region. And so that, I don't know, this Bahrain deal could be a prelude to something like that, which Trump, I think, has even suggested before. Like, the Saudis might want to join in on this eventually. So that would be, I think, a big deal for sure.
So, I think from my point of view, the kind of analysis that I had with the UAE deal sits with this one, where there's really not like a big peace thing here. It's not like the Bahrainians or the Emiratis were at war with the Israelis a couple months ago, and now there's peace. In fact, Israel in recent years has really cooperated with a lot of the Gulf Arab states in different initiatives, more, kind of covertly, not necessarily overt deals, but it's certainly not open hostilities. I mean, there's still, I think it's the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative that was signed by all these Gulf Arab states that essentially was them aligning with the Palestinians, saying that we're not going to recognize Israel until there's a Palestinian state. And so it wasn't like saying that Israel shouldn't exist. It was saying that Israel shouldn't exist with, half the population as third class subjugated citizens. That was kind of the point, I guess. And so now we're actually have two countries breaking that. But again, we're not talking about countries that were at war with Israel. And we're not talking about a country like Saudi Arabia. And so I think these are more PR wins. And I think the biggest beneficiary is Donald Trump. My guess is that the second winner is Benjamin Netanyahu. I guess the Emiratis win because they get to buy F-35s because they think those are good. I'm sure the Bahrainians get, some kind of kickback on the deal. Maybe they don't get F-35s. Maybe they do. Maybe they, get whatever that they're particularly interested in, or, they cement that, the U.S. Fifth Fleet keeps their base there. There's plenty of interest that they have with staying in the good graces of the U.S. I'm sure it's another country that, I'm guessing that Israel and the Emiratis aren't terrified of an incoming Biden administration. They don't think, oh no, Joe Biden, somebody's going to hold us accountable. They'll get away with what they want. They'll get their weapon sales. But Trump has been particularly friendly, in a lot of ways to these states and their foreign policy objectives. He assassinated Soleimani. That was huge. So we see a lot of responses, and I guess they probably feel like Biden might go back to the JCPOA and take, the possibility of war with Iran off the table. And Trump definitely won't do that. And so I'm guessing that these states are kind of calculating that if they could give Donald Trump a win leading up to the election, it would definitely just benefit them in the long run having Trump versus Biden. Although, like I said, I don't think they're going to cry if Biden wins.
Right. And yeah, you were mentioning some about who might have won from this, who might be the winners. And I guess if we have to, find who might have lost from this, I think it would probably be the Palestinians for sure. I mean, they've come out. All the Palestinian leadership, both the PA, the Hamas, the PLO, have all come out and said this is a stab in the back. This does grave harm to the Palestinian cause. There's all kinds of responses that Palestinian leadership have had. It's been very similar, in fact, to the response to the UAE deal. And I think the Palestinians largely don't want to see all these other Arab states cozying up and recognizing Israel, because I think they're afraid that they're going to be abandoned, that they won't support them anymore, that, Bahrain and the UAE and maybe Saudi eventually are going to, it's not as if they really heavily support them in the first place, but I think they're afraid that they're just going to totally drop them for the sake of maintaining their newfound relationship with the Israelis. And so I think the Palestinians don't like to see these kind of normalization agreements. Although I should say the Bahrainis and the Israelis and the U.S. put out this joint statement where they did mention the Palestinians. They said, we think this deal will it'll be good for the Palestinian cause and all this stuff. But they're not buying that, I think. I think they're seeing that as total lip service, and that they're taking this as a betrayal and a stab in the back, for sure.
Right. You would think for the Palestinians, it will almost be better if they came out and said, like, yeah, like, we had the cause for some years, but now it's just too profitable to be with the U.S. and Israel, so screw you guys. This is at least then it's like transparent, but no, we're helping you out, we're doing something, and it
That's for you,
right? The de facto leader of the Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ. His point of this was that it like delayed or suspended Israelianization that Netanyahu wasn't even trying to go forward with anyways. And so they got absolutely nothing for the Palestinians out of this. In fact, I think in a lot of ways it kind of says that the status quo in Israel is at least kind of okay. To say like you're going to suspend the current, annexation, and that's a good thing, and not say like Israel needs to do a lot more, something like that. I think leaves it and kind of just justifies the de facto annexation that we already have. And so in a lot of ways, this is a bigger loss for the Palestinians, the Emirates, saying that they got something for the Palestinians here rather than just admitting that they screwed them on it.
Right. And I mean, Netanyahu also, he said it's still on the table anyway, too. Like that
Right.
He may not have been really meaning to do it, immediately, but like he's saying, yeah, it's still on the table. So like, yeah, really, we can say that, chalk it up. They got nothing, the Palestinians, from this deal. From either of these deals.
Yeah, I'm guessing we'll start hearing about annexation when it starts to get politically convenient for Netanyahu again. Or maybe if Trump loses during Trump's lame duck period, he may try to ram something through because Biden really won't stand up to Israel, but he might not veto a resolution condemning them or something like that, the UNSC. And even that is just simply intolerable for Israel at this point. Will, are we missing anything else? Any other important stories you want to touch on before we wrap here?
No, I think we hit all the ones that we gathered up.
All right. Well, before we wrap up here, I do have just a few things to plug and mention. So, first of all, me and Will are working on the audio quality. We've gotten some feedback on that. The feedback is always appreciated, so keep letting us know. I really hope the audio on today's show turned out with our audio levels more equal. We're going to continue to like adjust and try to dial that in till it's perfect. So feel free to keep sending emails or commenting on videos and stuff, and just letting us know what we could do to even that out a little bit better. Ways you could get a hold of us, at con_interest on Twitter, search conflicts of interest on Facebook. Will is on Twitter at the Will Porter. I'm on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone_. Any of those places, hit us up. Be sure you're sharing the show. For former foreign policy focused listeners, try to switch over to the new feeds. I know most of you have done that already, which is awesome. I think so far it looks like most of the downloads are coming in on the new conflicts of interest feeds. So that's great. But if you haven't done that yet, be sure to do that. If you're listening on iTunes, ratings and reviews are helpful, especially as the show is just getting launched. Having a bunch of those makes it look a lot more, legitimate to somebody who's just passing by. And then I have noticed from the YouTube stats that it looks like a majority of the people who are listening on YouTube are not subscribing to the show. So if you listen to the whole show on YouTube and you're still listening now, it must mean that you're pretty happy with it. So go ahead and click the subscribe button and help us. We're trying to get to like 100 subscribers by the end of the week would be great. So Will, did I miss anything?
No, man, you got it all.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back with a new show on Wednesday.
Peace, y'all.